So I was thinking, Pavel, about how game books have changed. I mean, they've been going since at least the 1980s, and some people trace it back to the 1920s or 30s, I think. But when I was writing um, some of my early game books, we just assumed you'd be using dice. It was kind of like D&D in a book in those days. And all of those games had to have randomness. But role-playing games and game books have both moved clearly. Like in the 90s, I did Heart of Ice and those other books, and they were diceless. And nowadays, we don't necessarily expect dice. So what was your thinking when you were developing your game books and thinking about Whispers Beyond the Stars? What was the reasoning for moving away from using dice?
Mhm. Historically, my first game books that I read was like fighting fantasy style game books. So I never imagined game books without dice. So for me,
Mhm.
the dice were very crucial part of game books. But the more I read different type of game books, I realized that it doesn't need to be like that. And this is also what I think about the very um, expanded mechanics in game books. I think that the more story-based game book is, that the less mechanics and dice it needs. But if you are moving towards more open world and more freedom to user to the player to go to different places to execute some tasks by his own, in this kind of open world game books, it works very well when you have more advanced mechanics and more roles. But currently, with in Whispers Beyond the Stars, this is more story-oriented game book where, of course, you have your freedom of choice. You have different narrative paths. You can make your choices, but there is some kind of story you are following. And in this case, I think there is no need to use dice. And this is very similar, like with in Heart of Ice of you, Dave, where you can deal with it. I mean, you still can have some mechanics, like for example, the skills, right, or health or sanity, and of course keywords, because this is the most important part of the game books of such kind, that with keywords you can record the history of the player. So, other words, the more you focus on storytelling and presentation of the world and choices and different maybe moral aspects or other aspects of the world nature or human nature, then the less dice you need. This is my opinion. Maybe
Yeah.
Dave, you can also
Well,
say a couple of words.
obviously in role playing, when you fail a dice roll, a skill roll or whatever, it doesn't close off options. It just changes. I'm trying to sneak into the castle and rescue somebody, and I trip over a you know, a helmet that somebody's left on the floor and make a noise, and the story goes in a new direction because of that. But clearly, in game books, we have to pre-prepare it, so we can't improvise as you can at the table with a role-playing game. So there's always been that problem that if you fail a roll, I mean, it's a failure for the author and for the player if that just blocks an interesting path forward. So I think it becomes much more interesting to think um, I'm having to manage the balancing of my skills. That if I focused a lot on combat and then I realize combat isn't going to be the way through this, then I'll have to get smart about what other skills I have and how to use them. Um, and it won't be down to a dice roll, it will be down to my strategy, which I think, as you say, is much more story orientated, but it's also acknowledging that we we can't improvise on this. Maybe game books in 10 years' time will have an AI component that just runs like a GM and steps in when you would have failed, so that you fail forward, as it were. Um, but at the time nowadays, I think that the tendency in both role playing and game books has been um, either to make failures interesting or to consider, as you say, that they're not dice based, which is always kind of dull. You roll the dice, it's like, it's a 2 and it should have been a 6. It's much more interesting to think, oh, I made the roll. I should have used a different skill. Then it's on you, and I feel that feels rewarding in a way that just watching the dice ruin your day is not.
And I also think that game books changed their role during these years. So in 80s, it was maybe it could be treated as a some kind of gateway to RPGs. So
Mhm.
something that is more lightweight, that is prepared, say, but it introduced dice. So
Mhm.
you try with some dice throwing system with maybe with just one uh, statistics like skill, right? In fantasy. But this is a gateway, and then the next logical step is going to RPGs when you have a lot of skills, you have a lot of types of dice, and so on. But I think over the years, the game book established their own presence as their own, and right now, in this kind of story-based game books, you just don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is my opinion.
Yeah, because it's always been called game book, and I think for a long time the game thing overbalanced the book side, and that increasingly stories came in. I'm certainly when Mark Smith and I were pitching what were the virtual reality books, Heart of Ice and the others, we said these should be things that when you read them, they feel more like a proper novel, that they're real characters and a story that isn't just there is a bad guy in a dungeon and you must go through a dungeon meeting a lot of random goblins and old guys with potions, and at the end of the dungeon you'll kill the bad guy. But how many times can people possibly read that story? So we have to make them richer stories, and in doing that we're acknowledging that the story is important. The gameplay game isn't even, well, there are many things that games can be, but the 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 Dungeons and Dragons model of the 80s is not, I think, what game books follow these days.